everybody, and welcome to my first lecture in what I hope will be a thematic series of lectures throughout my tenure here as a GM in residence. And the theme of these lectures is going to have to do with planning ahead, sort of building a plan in chess. And to me, this is like one of the hardest things to do. Not even talking about like the right plan, just finding a plan, even if it's not the best or sometimes wrong. It's a very difficult thing to do because it requires you to really get to the bottom of things in a position and realize what's important. So that's the exercise that we're going to be getting at in these two games that I prepared for today. Now, this first game, it's a game I played fairly recently at an Open in Florianópolis, Brazil, against a very strong player, the #1 ranked player in Argentina. And this game went e4, e5, and we quickly went into a Ruy Lopez variation. And since I correctly, it turns out, assumed that my opponent would be better prepared than me, I decided to play a fairly I wouldn't say unusual, but it's certainly a variation that is not at the peak of its popularity for black. So I thought I would catch my opponent a little bit off guard, and I especially like the positional battles that tend to result from this opening. So white played d4, and after b5, bishop b3, d5, black's idea is to give back the pawn in order to reach this position. So this is basically the starting position of what's known as the open Morphy variation or the open Ruy Lopez. You can pick your name. But basically, what's going on here is that black has created a break in the symmetry because black will now have a pawn majority on the queen side and white will have a pawn majority on the king side. So one of the most common themes in these middle games are who's going to get there first. Is black going to get to play c5 or is white going to get to play f4? It's really kind of an open question. We haven't really gotten a definitive answer, and I think I have a hunch that black is doing fine here, and this is why I play the line. So anyway, white has a lot of options. I don't want to dwell too much on the opening. In this game, white chose the absolute main line, which is c3, preparing a timely knight d4, right? Because the point is to get these pawns rolling as quickly as possible. So after c3, bishop c5, knight d2, and castle kingside. Black also has other ways of playing. Sometimes the bishop goes to e7, the knight goes to c5. But this opening had caught my attention because after the move bishop c2, the first important step for white is to get rid of my knight on e4. This is probably my most aggressive piece and what's holding white back from freely moving this knight away from f3 and playing f4, f5. So, for example, if white were to force me to take on d2, after something like bishop takes d2, I don't know, I just want to make a couple of random moves for black to illustrate a point. White will try to seize control over d4, maybe with a move like, I don't know if queen e2 would work, and if rook d8, something like bishop e3. I don't know if I should throw b4 in or not, but let's say I arrive at a position like this. Knight takes, pawn takes. This is white's dream come true because I've clamped down on the c5 square. It means you're not going to get to do what you want, and I'm ready to start pushing f4, f5. These kinds of changes in the position are exactly what white is looking for and black needs to avoid. So, of course, both sides could have played a lot better here. I'm not going to dwell on it, but now we have a visual on what to do and what not to do. Black's idea is absolutely radical here. The point is to take on f2 and create a further imbalance in the position. This time, the imbalance is not going to be about the pawn structure. It's not going to be about who has the pawn majority where. It's going to be a material imbalance. Because after rook takes f2, we're going to get a situation where black is going to get a rook, and we'll see two pawns for two minor pieces. And rook versus minor pieces is one of the oldest strategic themes in the book. And when I choose an opening, I want to choose, okay, what kind of theme is going to predominate in this game? So after f6, white played knight f1, which I think is the best move. You might be thinking, well, why would I give you my e5 pawn? Why can't I just take on f6? Well, after bishop takes, king takes, queen takes f6, if you go knight f1 now, turns out black's position is really rolling here. After knight e5, I got bishop g4 coming, I've got knight takes f3, I've got queen h4. So many moves, it looks like black's pieces are just swarming towards the white king. So this is not the line that worries me when I play this position with black. The line that worries me is the one that white played in this game, knight f1, because now white is threatening to play bishop e3 and keep the rook. So after bishop takes f2, king takes f2, f takes e5, we get to the position that I wanted to discuss today. So everything up until now has been sort of a preface, a leading up to this moment. So black has rook and two pawns against bishop and knight. How would you guys evaluate this position? Who do you think has the better of it and why? Because remember that the goal of this lecture is to work on our planning, right? We want to build a plan. What is a plan in chess? A plan is simply a sketch of the position that shows you where each piece wants to go and what target those pieces are going to be working together on, right? So in this position, let's say we'll make one more move for white because it's kind of an obvious move. Black is threatening e4, the knight is pinned, so white has to go king g1. So I would say this is the starting position. So any takers here as to, when you look at this, what you feel? Do you feel more attracted towards black's position, towards white's position? Are there any certain virtues or problems that you see with either side? Yeah?
I would prefer black, because it's a material plus, by most counts of the pieces.
Yeah, that's fair.
And then also, you have this dangerous central pass pawn.
Mm-hmm. Right, so you're up material and you have, this pass pawn. So it seems like it's up to white to compensate, right? To say, okay, yes, you have these things, but there's an underlying problem with your position that I can take advantage of with the minor pieces. So those are definitely the trumps that black has. But what are some problems that black is going to be dealing with? So who is willing to play, devil's advocate here and maybe defend white a little bit?
White's got the bishop pair on pretty nice open diagonals.
Yes, that's absolutely true, right? These bishops are pointing straight at our king side, so we need to be very careful. And anything else? I think that's pretty good. I think that's a pretty good outline, right? Black has extra material and very interesting control over the center, but white has some serious potential for an attack on the king side. So how would you handle this position as black? You mentioned you like black's position. What would your next moves be? Or at least, which moves jump out at you? Like, what do you want to see happen in the next 3 or 4 moves?
E4, knight e5.
Okay, this is fantastic, right? We would love to do this because the pawn on e4 would shut down the bishop on c2, right? So it would no longer have such an extensive reach towards our king. If our knight could get to e5, that would be great, because then maybe we could move our c-pawn forward. And then we would achieve our ultimately open morphy goal, which is to mobilize our queen side. Black almost always wins the game on the queen side. We need to remember that, because that line was drawn in the sand very early on in the game. So I think you really hit sort of the key theme here. Black wants to go e4, knight e5. The question is, why can't we just do it right away? Or can we? Maybe we can. Do you see any immediate problems with this?
Knight to d4.
Okay, and how is this a problem?
If knight takes back, we take with pawn, and that stops us from playing c5.
Yeah, I mean, this is strategically devastating for us, right? We didn't get our knight to e5. Our pawn gets fixed on c7, meaning, you know, we're never going to be able to play c5. And that's it. We're stopped dead on our tracks. White's next moves are going to be probably bishop e3, knight g3, rook c1, and this is just a nightmare. We're sitting ducks as black. So this is what black needs to be careful with. Black cannot afford a bad trade or having the c-pawn sort of locked in place. But really the trading of the knight is crucial here. So now that we know what our North Star is, how can we try to get there? So e4 was one candidate move, didn't quite work. So let's, instead of giving up on it and just tossing it, let's tweak it a little bit, right? So how can we improve that idea? How can we prepare it?
Bishop g4.
Okay, I actually played a game, this is one of my first games in this line, where I did go bishop g4. And this looks, at first, it just looks devastating, because we're about to take on f3, we're going to break up White's kingside pawn structure, expose this king even further. But this is going to reveal a hidden drawback in Black's position. Because let's say you go bishop g4, right? And let's say I go knight e3. What's your next move? I would think you would have to go bishop takes f3 just to be consistent, because I'm otherwise threatening to take your d5 pawn. And going back to e6, you just wasted two moves. So after bishop takes f3, g takes f3, what problem arises here? Does anybody...
For black, right?
Yeah, I mean, what does black have to deal with here?
The open g5.
Well, do you think this is a problem for black?
Not right now.
I would say quite the opposite, right? It's like the only good thing black has going for him. No, I mean, you have a huge problem with your d5 pawn. Not only that, your e4 knight e5 idea just went out the window, right? So you would probably have to play something like knight e7, but here, this is a very passive alternative to what we were just talking about. It looks like White's just going to seize the initiative, maybe something like queen d3, and after g6, the knight's coming to g4. And what you mentioned earlier, right, about White's bishop pointing at our king side, turns out to be a very serious, very real problem. White has a crushing position here. Everything has failed for black. So bishop g4, a move that's hard to resist, but a move that exposes how delicate this center is, right? This is not, this can be a strength for black, but it can be a liability as well. So we need to tend to this center. We need to reinforce it and stabilize it before we can move on the offensive, right? These moves are very aggressive moves, but our position is simply not ready for that kind of aggression yet. We need to build up our position. So in the chat here, there's an interesting suggestion. Actually, it's a terrible suggestion. It's what I played, which is a mistake. But it's a good place to start. The move Queen F6. And Queen F6, it's actually not obvious why this is a mistake. But realizing why Queen F6 is a mistake will help us understand the next game I want to show you, which is a recent game that Magnus Carlsen played. So that's just a little teaser for what's coming up in just a few minutes. But what could be the drawback behind the move Queen F6? And actually, let me rephrase that question. We just spent some time figuring out what Black's plan was, right? And we said, well, we really want to play e4 and knight e5. And there's a problem with knight d4, so we kind of have to address that, all right? And Queen F6 seeks to address that by defending the bishop. So right after e4, knight d4, not only can I play knight e5, but I can also consider ideas like Queen F2 check, and I have some pressure on the F file. So that's the basic idea of Queen F6. So for example, if something like Bishop E3, I was going to play E4, and after knight D4, knight E5. This was my big idea. Because I don't really care about having this bishop traded off. I care about having this knight on E5 and this pawn on E4. So this was the position that I was hoping to get as Black. But what I failed to do was to put myself in White's shoes. Just like I figured out, okay, what is my plan? I didn't ask myself, well, what does White want to do? What is White's next 4 or 5 moves going to look like? So can anybody sort of sketch out an outline of where you would like White's pieces to go? Because this is the plan that later is going to serve as our roadmap to navigate a very complex middle game. So,
Knight to G5.
Okay, so knight to G5. Is this a plan, or is this just like a forced sequence that you see, like, okay, I can win something here?
Looking at knight to G5, queen to H5, kind of trying to, because your bishops are protected, you can potentially sacrifice on an H7, potentially kind of opening up something over there. I don't see the full sequence in my head per se, but.
Okay, now, but when you look at a move like knight G5, is there anything that you're concerned about as White? Is there anything that you're neglecting by choosing knight G5?
H6.
What's that?
H6.
Like if you go knight G5, I could go H6, but maybe then you take on E6 or you go knight H7. I don't think that's really what the trade-off, right? Because knight G5, what you're doing is you're moving a piece you've already moved, right? So that comes at the expense of some other piece that deserves attention and is not getting it. So knight G5 comes at the expense of what? Yes, it just so happens that you're getting checkmated, right? But even if you miss this tactic, right? Queen F2 check, King H1, and Queen takes F1, which is forced checkmate. Even if you miss that, there should be something suspicious about knight G5, because you still have a totally underdeveloped queen side, right? It's like, this bishop is a problem and you don't know how to solve it, so you figure, hey, I'll just deal with that later, right? Like, why would I worry about a problem now? And that's sort of a subconscious way of thinking. Like, you're like, oh, but I want to play knight G5, so if I have to choose between doing what I want to do and dealing with a problem, I'll just do what I want. That doesn't work out so well in the long run. So it's important to identify the biggest problem that you have and solve that first. Now, of course, if knight G5 were to win immediately, you would be right, but it doesn't. So this is White's big problem. And we need to sketch out a plan for White that puts this dark square bishop as this sort of centerpiece. We want our greatest weakness to become our greatest source of pride in the position. So can anybody take another shot at this?
Bishop G5.
Okay, and where's that bishop going? Let's say I go queen f7.
H4 maybe?
Okay, and that might be threatening finally, you know, the knight g5. So let's say I go like h6.
Bishop G3.
Bingo, right? That's the key. The key maneuver in this position is to reroute the bishop from c1 all the way back to g3. g3 is the golden square because from there, the bishop's going to cover f2, so you never run into queen f2 check again. The bishop's going to put pressure on e5. It's going to control the e5 square, making your e4 knight e5 idea a lot harder, if not impossible. And it's going to be out of the way, right? It's going to let you continue improving your position, right? So this is going to be one piece of the puzzle, but it's the biggest piece. So let's keep building our plan with white, right? So we found a key idea, bishop g5, h4, g3. What about the other pieces? Where is everything else going to go? And remember, you want your pieces to have purpose, right? You don't just want to develop them for the sake of development, saying, okay, the knight is out, so now it's the knight's problem. He's got to fend for himself. You want to sink your teeth into something that's wrong with your opponent's position. You want to sort of peel away at a weakness until it just becomes a hole in the wall, right? Too big to ignore. So let's say we magically get our bishop to g3. Okay, that's done. Where is everything else going to go? What target can white find? Any ideas back there? Well, in the chat, there's a suggestion for a4. And I don't really think, I think a4 is kind of a way of delaying the question one more move because you're not really telling me like where your pieces are going to go. So this bishop and this knight, to me, those are the big enigmas in white's position. Like, what are these pieces doing? They're not really doing anything. They look fine. They look like they're out of the way. But where is the pressure? Like, what have you done for me lately, bishop on c2 and knight on f1? Nothing. So how can we give purpose to these two pieces? Yeah?
Maybe think about knight e3, bishop d3.
Excellent. And now your pieces are converging over a common target. So from being scattered, bishop around here, knight around here, queen here, all of a sudden they go in like V formation, right, towards this d5 pawn. So this is the essence of white's position. White wants to get a bishop to g3, bishop to b3, knight to e3, and the game is over if that happens, because black's center just begins to collapse. So that brings us back to my wonderful queen f6 move. Why is this such a bad move? What do you usually need to do to win a chess game, by the way, just in general?
Have tempo.
What's that?
Have tempo.
Have tempo? What does that mean?
You're on the initiative, you're attacking, they're defending.
Okay, but I think that you can go even deeper than that, right? Because when you have the initiative, when you're attacking, You're doing something. You're putting your opponent in a very specific situation, which is you're creating problems for your opponent. Your opponent has to solve a problem. He has to make a decision. You can only make mistakes when you have a decision to make, right? If you force your opponent to make only move after only move, it's very hard for your opponent to make a mistake, right? He's just going to, oh, it's the only move. Fantastic. And as Anand said, only moves are always good moves, right? So if you're forcing your opponent to make the best move all of the time, you're going to be like, geez, this game is really hard to win. So what you want to do is put your opponent in a situation where he has to make a decision. When I play the move Queen F6, from a strategic point of view, this is a big mistake because I'm not making it harder for White to carry out his plan, right? This is his dream. Oops, I went a little too far with that arrow. This is his dream scenario, and I should be making this harder for him. And Queen F6 is basically an invitation. It's saying, hey, that's a really good plan. Let me help you out and get your bishop to G3 as soon as possible. So sure enough, he plays bishop G5, and after Queen F7, bishop H4. So now knight G5 is a threat. So I have to play H6, and he goes bishop G3. So the hardest part of his plan he's already accomplished, and I have very little to show for it. Not only that, my E5 pawn is under attack, and if I go E4, now after knight D4, guess what? I don't have knight E5. So my entire plan is falling apart. So I was already in trouble here. That's why I had to come up with a radical solution, and I played rook A D8. So here is where some interesting tactical questions arise. What happens if knight takes E5? How is black going to compensate for the loss of this incredibly important pawn? I'm not sure. I see some movement in the back, but it's really dark, so I don't know if it's a hand being raised or somebody moving. But does anybody in the back have an idea against knight takes E5? It's an idea that we've encountered already, right? The weakness of this F2 square and how this king is a little bit more exposed. After knight takes, bishop takes, queen F2, king H1, and here it's where it's like, okay, but now what? Where do I go from here? Because a check on F2 is scary, but it doesn't seem like there's anything too terrible happening. Yeah?
D4 to open up the diagonal for your bishop.
You're definitely onto the right idea. But if D4, let's say if I go C takes D4, I'll sort of indulge you a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, looking at bishop D5.
Yes, and this is actually crushing. Now black is winning. All of black's pieces are doing a great job. There's no way to stop the capture on G2. Now the problem is that C takes D4 is not really a forced move, right? So here white can use this opportunity to launch a counter-offensive, you could call it. Maybe white could start with queen D3, or maybe white could say, let me kick this queen out first, and then worry about taking on D4. So D4 would be fantastic if you had one more move, but it's like you take your foot off the gas just for one moment, and white is able to strike back. But this idea of getting the bishop to this diagonal is absolutely key. So what more direct way do you have? I see in the chat somebody is suggesting the move bishop H3. It's a very nice idea, but the problem is after G takes, you don't really have a good follow-up, right? And you're still going to get kicked out. Any other suggestions?
Bishop to G4 work.
Okay. interesting, right? Because if queen takes g4, then you again have this back rank problem and you get checkmated. So I have to move my queen away. Let's say I go queen c1. And now you're so close.
Yeah, I couldn't see the next move. It looked good, but then I couldn't follow up.
Right? So the only way that you're going to break through is by getting into this diagonal.
Bishop F3.
Yes, brilliant. Bishop F3. It's only good enough for a draw, but considering how badly black messed this up with queen F6, that's pretty good, right? Pawn takes, queen takes, and perpetual.
Oh, okay.
So it's kind of a defensive resource at this point because black is just fighting to stay in the game. Okay, bishop takes e5 is actually a lot worse because after knight takes, queen f2, king h1. Now, how can black play? Come on, man, it's your time to shine.
D4.
You got it. Yes, now d4 is fantastic because, again, you know, if c takes d4, bishop d5, that's lights out. And if queen d3, now it's a very different situation because you have bishop f5. And you're just going to take the bishop on c2. And there's no bishop g3, right, kicking the queen out. So there's really no good way of stopping bishop d5. Maybe you have to do something like bishop b3. But let's say after, you know, takes, and king h7, for example, you have some back rank problems that are pretty serious. You have this d-pawn that's a pretty serious problem. And overall, I mean, black's position is just amazing. So the pawn on e5 cannot be captured. This is excellent news for black. So white plays, well, what should white have played here? I remember I was very surprised with the move my opponent played. Pleasantly surprised. Yeah, right? Because that's the whole reason why we drew the sketch of the position. It's to have a guideline. Like, we're like faced with this incredibly complicated position. You're like, oh, I don't know which way is up, which way is down. You always go back to your sketch, right? Okay, what were the moves that I wanted to play? Well, can I play any of them here? So the candidate moves should be knight e3 and bishop b3, right? Before you even start looking at anything else. Because this is what's going to complete your plan. So I was expecting the move knight e3. And my idea was to play d4, but here I originally missed a very strong move. And after this move, black might be losing. And this is probably a very important subtlety between starting with knight e3 and starting with bishop b3. They are not the same thing.
Instead of moving that pawn or after?
No, after black plays d4, what can white play here? Well, bishop b3, I'm just taking your knight, right? And attacking your queen. That doesn't seem like a very good deal.
Knight takes e5.
Knight takes e5. I think I can just take here, and after bishop takes, I still take your knight. Not to mention there's a check on f2 that might be interesting, as always. any other ways of sort of hammering away at a problem that black has? I mean, this goes back to the very beginning, like when you said what are the good things about white's position, the first thing that came up was that the bishops are pointing at the black king.
Queen to D3.
Queen to D3, of course, right? It's kind of like the natural follow-up to having the bishop point at the king, get the queen in there, right? So after queen D3, I really have no good way of stopping queen H7. I have to do some painful move like G6. I remember in the game I was looking at G5, and the big problem I saw here was this nasty in-between move, queen E4. Because now after pawn takes knight, white takes here, and my center's collapsing, right? This is not what I had in mind. So I think white just missed this, luckily for me, and instead played queen D2, which, if you think about it, doesn't make any sense because it doesn't fit in with any of the things that we were talking about. It doesn't help you put pressure on D5. It doesn't help you put pressure on this diagonal. So it's kind of an empty vessel of a move. It's a move that, okay, you know, the queen is better on D2 than it was on D1, but it has no real purpose. So after queen D2, I was able to play D4. And now after bishop E4, here's where I had my chance in the game. I think after rook D8 and D4, I was forced to change plans, right? My original plan of going E4, knight E5, it blew up in my face because queen F6 was the wrong way of going about it. Instead, having forced my queen to F7, I figured, well, I should probably turn my attention to the queen side immediately. And that's why I played for this D4 idea. Because now there's pressure on A2, there's pressure on the D file. This queen turned out to be pretty seriously misplaced on D2. But black's next move is key in this position. So how would you guys play as black? Well, first of all, this is a threat, right? So we have to deal with that. So a couple of options would be to play d takes c3, attacking the queen, or bishop d5, blocking the threat on the knight.
I'd probably take c3.
Why? After queen takes c3, your knight's still under attack. Well, but I'm going to take your knight, right? I can play queen takes knight. And overall, this is a very tricky trade for black, right? Trading this pawn that was restricting white's position for this pawn on c3 that wasn't doing anything, I think is a pretty bad deal in general for black. Not to mention that now white has all his artillery pointed at my e5 pawn. This is what I played, by the way. So this was strike 2 for me. The reason I played this was because I felt I could solve the problem of my knight in an active way by going knight d4. And I figured, well, I'll just replenish my my d4 pawn. Maybe I can go like e takes d4. But actually, I kind of gave up on this because I didn't want to lose my pawn on c7. Although after bishop takes a2, I think this is playable for black. It's not so easy. But in the game, I played rook takes d4, which is a worse move. And after bishop f3, only now did I play bishop d5. But notice how everything is kind of broken up now. This is a much sloppier center for black. And once your center collapses, it's the beginning of the end. So the key move in this position was to play bishop d5, destabilizing white's clamp over the center. And now if bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, this is not an easy position for white. I mean, I'm not sure what white would play. Maybe if white tries to put more pressure on e5, then you can easily start to see things like this happening, right? I have this amazing pawn. If you take on e5, well, that's fantastic news, but maybe I'll just play like c5, c4, and this pawn on d3 is just going to tie you down for the rest of the game, right? And then I can start playing on the queen side as well. So black is much, much better in these kinds of positions. Unfortunately, I took on c3, and after queen takes, knight d4, I wasn't able to tie white's pieces down anywhere near that position we were just looking at with the pawn on d3. So bishop d5 was too little, too late, and I made a couple of bad decisions down the line. I arrived at this endgame, and actually, things went relatively well for me here. But now I made the strategic blunder that lost the game. So I want to see if you guys can find the right plan for black. It's a very delicate position for black, but black is absolutely fine here. So white is threatening rook takes c5. How would you deal with this? And if you're about to say c4, you better start thinking that there might be something wrong with that, because it's the obvious move. So in the chat, there's one suggestion of defending the pawn with rook c8. I don't really think this is going to solve the problem, because there's an issue here that has to do with planning, right? White's minor pieces have no purpose. They're not doing anything. So white needs to solve this problem immediately, because I'm really rolling. You know, my rook might come to d1. If I can start pushing my pawns, get a passed pawn, maybe a rook behind the pawn, I have a very clear plan. I want to promote my c pawn. I want to play rook c8, you know, c4, b4, c3, and the game is basically over. So white needs to step up and counter this. And the secret to doing that lies with the recycling of these minor pieces. c4, the move I played, is a strategic blunder, because once again, I fail to think, like, what is my opponent trying to do? How is he trying to rearrange his pieces? Like when I played queen f6, I allowed white to go bishop g5 and put the bishop on g3 without a fight. So what move can white play here?
Robert, can you scroll up a little bit?
Yes. What move can white play that will improve white's position, but at the same time, it will deal a devastating blow to my plan, right? Of doing this, this, and this. In the chat, somebody's saying knight h4. Well, this has nothing to do with what's going on the queen side, so that's not going to be the move. Also, you're working on a sort of self-mate there, eventually, when I go rook d1.
Bishop e1.
Brilliant. Bishop e1. Now the bishop's coming to c3, and after a3, white has a total clamp on the queen side. My pawns are not going anywhere, right? So it completely kills my counterplay. So that's why c4 is a mistake. Now we need to find an improvement. By the way, rook c8, the move previously mentioned, doesn't work because now bishop e1 is actually not as good. Why not? What does having the pawn still on c5 allow me to do that I couldn't do with the pawn on c4?
b4?
Yes, b4. This is key because it prevents the bishop from getting to where it wants to go. And this is actually a difficult position for white because white can never really coordinate the minor pieces the way that he would like to. The bishop on e1 is awkward. So that was the key, right? To keep the pawn on c5 in case that bishop tries to make its way back to c3. Now, the reason that I don't like rook c8 so much is because after rook e7, the bishop is still going to find its way to this diagonal, and it's going to put some pretty nasty pressure on g7. So the best move, I think, is just to, you could throw in a check, but it's probably going to transpose, to go b4, and now give up the c5 pawn and instead pick up the b2 pawn. So you just change the nature of your pawn majority. Instead of having a 3 against 2, you have a 2 against 1, which actually makes your pawn majority stronger. And I don't know, if something like rook a5, then you start bringing your rook into the game, you know, takes, and at the very least you can take on g2, you can give a check. Black is doing okay. So, you know, this was not an easy move to find. Just like, oh, whatever, just take my most important pawn. So, but after c4, this is just completely hopeless. I'll just show you a few more moves, but you can start to see how black's position just starts to die out, right? After a3, you can tell nothing's happening here. And in the meantime, white has all the potential, right? White's going to go rook d6, maybe bring the king up, maybe get the knight involved. So sky's the limit for white's pieces. My rooks are all tapped out. Like I couldn't tell you a good square for my rooks. So played rook e6, king e8, rook c1, trying to cut the king off, and after rook d7, I'm already in some weird mating net here, and that's going to happen very soon. Right here, takes, and now the king joins in. So now check, king g6, and I'm just getting mated, right? Because now if rook e8, knight e6, king g8, and checkmate. Okay, so that's sort of the first game, and now that we have that as sort of a backdrop, I'm going to show you this position from Carlsen Niemann, which was played in a rapid tournament that's still going on, called the Charity Cup. And this game is only a couple of days old. And I remember after losing my game, I was like, I can't believe I always play these terrible lines that nobody plays, and then, you know, this game happens and they reach the exact same position. So I was like, okay, well, these guys are pretty good. So maybe the line's not so bad. So we know that e4, premature. We know that bishop g4 neglects the center. We know that queen f6 does not anticipate white's plan. It actually encourages it. So Niemann plays the right move in this position. He plays queen d6. And this is a key move because it reinforces the center, it defends the bishop, therefore it prepares e4 followed by knight e5. And now Carlsen plays bishop g5. This move was actually a novelty, but after having discussed our game, we can see that bishop g5 actually makes a lot of sense. Carlsen is just trying to get to g3 to put pressure on e5. By the way, you might say, well, this is a novelty. Well, what did white do before this? White still tried to get the same idea, but tried to get to g3 this way, which is reasonable, right? There's nothing wrong with this. But Carlsen goes for g5 because he wants to keep the e3 square for the knight. And now after e4, knight d4, knight e5, things are flowing much better for black. Knight e3, bishop d7. Black is keeping all the pieces on the board, and c5 is coming. So white needs to be very careful because these pieces do not have enough, they're not anchored, right? They don't have enough protection from attack by black's pawns. So white plays bishop h4, and the next move is going to be bishop g3. So I'm going to give you two moves here as black. c5 and queen h6. Which one would you play? There are more moves, but I think these are the critical choices. Any votes? Let's take a survey here. So who goes for queen h6? 1? Is it 1 or am I missing someone? I think it's 1. And what about c5? Okay, so c5 definitely takes the cake. Also in the chat, most people are suggesting c5. And c5 is the right move. I mean, if you can play c5, you should do it because it's your entire plan, right? Since you played this variation, it's built on the assumption that you're going to be able to play on the queen side. And the only way, or the most effective way of doing that, is by pushing c5. So unless there's something really, really wrong with this, you go for it. And really, the knight is driven back. I don't know if Carlsen thought maybe he could go bishop g3 anyway, and if c takes, but actually now queen h6 is devastating because you unpin the queen while you attack the knight at the same time. So that doesn't work. Another idea that I thought was interesting was bishop b3, the other key move, part of White's plan. Notice how these are kind of tactical nuances, but at the same time, they fit in perfectly with the plan that we laid out for White. So it's not a coincidence that your most interesting tactical ideas happen to fall perfectly in place with the general sketch of the position that you laid out. So the point of bishop b3 is that now if you take the knight, I can take on d5, and after king h8, I can take the rook, and after rook takes, I can, I don't know, just take on d4. I don't know, this position to me looks absolutely fine for black, right? This knight on d3 is a monster. So c5 was the key move. Niemann played queen h6, and this is a losing move. So now it's White to play and win. So I'll give you guys a chance to think for a minute here.
Knight takes d5.
Okay, and if I take your bishop? That looks pretty good for black because I'm also going to come into f2 after that, right? So not knight takes d5. Anybody else? They found it in the chat. The big problem with queen h6 is that it neglects something that we've touched on that's very important, right? A part of black's position that's particularly vulnerable, and that is the center, right? This center that we've been arguing whether it's a strength or a weakness for black, really it can be either one up until the very end. But if you don't tend to it with your pieces as black, it's going to fall apart. And here, you're right to think that knight takes d5, that should be sort of in the general direction where you're aiming at. But unfortunately, your bishop hangs. The winning move is knight f5, because it's not the knight that wants to capture on d5, it's the queen. The queen is going to be much more devastating. It's going to check the king, it's going to attack the knight, the bishop, and the rook. So the trick is that after bishop takes f5, I just go knight takes f5 again. I'm defending the bishop, I'm attacking the queen, and if you go rook takes f5, I just go queen takes d5, and then I take on a8. And this is actually checkmate, so the game is over. So here you're in a huge, you have a huge problem. You're about to lose your d5 pawn and your queen is hanging. So it would seem like queen e6 is the only move. And now, how does White put this away? And if king h8?
Queen takes on d5.
That's correct. But come on, doesn't this look cooler?
It does.
Yeah. So, you know, And besides, you showed me a game where you'd appreciate, you know, a cool finish, right? So I think queen takes d5 is pretty awesome, because if queen takes check, then you take here, and the center collapses and the game is over, right? You can't even fight it, because e3 I just take it. So anyway, after knight takes f5 or knight f5, the center collapses, and that's why queen h6 was a mistake. You didn't build up your center enough to relieve your queen of those duties. So Niemann just tried his desperate move, knight f3, probably his only chance. And after queen takes, queen b6, queen e3, rook takes f5. And now the problem is that white inflicts this devastating change to black's pawn structure, because now without a c pawn, you can never support your d5 pawn. And also you can never play c5 and d4. So your pawns are stuck. So now bishop f2 hits b6, contains the pawns, rook b8, rook d1, king f7, bishop b3, king e6, and rook d4. And the center collapses, right? I'm threatening rook takes e4, and you have no good squares for the king, right? If you go here, peekaboo. And if you go anywhere else, I just take on d5. So the game went on a few more moves. I'll actually show the entire game, because it really wasn't that long. But anyway, the bishops basically just tore black's position apart. And notice that the center has completely vanished now, right? So it's no surprise that like one move after the center is gone, black just resigned here. You can't stop either me taking on h7 or coming after your a6 pawn, or most likely both. So anyway, I just wanted to show you these two games, because I have a little bit of my own experience mixed in there, so I can give you my impressions of the position. But also, it's a position that two of the world's best players right now tried out just a couple days ago. So it's I really enjoy sort of seeing what these guys are doing, and then if I get a chance, just try to do it too. And so I feel like, well, I'm on the same page, you know, I know what they're talking about. But overall, I think it's a fascinating opening. I think it doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves, and I hope you guys enjoyed our little conversation here. So thanks.